Hello, everyone. Thank you very much for sticking around until the last presentation. I have to say, I feel super humbled to be up here speaking because everyone in this room is probably way smarter than I am, and I just want to thank everyone that we've been talking to over the past couple of days, and thank you, CannMed, for making this work. So, vaping, a lot of controversies. I'm not going to dive deep into a lot of detail of what's doable. I just want to give an overview because we still need to do a lot of research when it comes to vaping. We're going to specifically focus on emissions and rheology. A lot of people talk about viscosity when it comes to vaping. Well, viscosity is only a little piece of it. There's a lot more involved. The process of vaporization is a mix between chemistry, fluid mechanics, thermodynamics, and not just putting oil in a tank. One of the key things here to understand as a consumer, when you buy a product, you're not buying just the oil or just the hardware. It has to be a symbiotic relationship between the two. You can have the safest, cleanest oil in a bad hardware, and the consumer will still have a bad experience, and vice versa. The initial goal of this was really R&D and understanding how we can better deliver the cannabinoids, terpenes, all of the different components that we're continually discovering every day for patients. But we kind of made the scope a lot bigger as we're pulling back these onion layers of research and what's going on with cannabis vaping. So, what are the variables that affect aerosolization? Everyone says vaping, but it's not really vapor. It's aerosols through the use of, for instance, a 510 thread cartridge. And how do we measure the influence? The answer is emissions testing and rheology. Emissions testing is testing really the vapor that comes out of it. All of the regulation right now tests the oil that goes into these devices. The problem is there's a state change there. What comes out of it is not at all what goes in. So obviously, why do you do emissions testing? Consumer safety, transparency, quality control, future regulatory compliance. I think it's very easy to understand that once we enter federal legalization, FDA is going to come in and they are going to regulate the hell out of this and ask us for all of this data. It happened with the nicotine vaping industry. It happened with food supplements. It's going to happen with cannabis. And I think it's very important that as an industry, we're prepared with data, with information to explain to these regulators exactly how things work and start working today for future regulation. When we look at emissions, one of the components is a puffing regime. So a regular tobacco puffing regime is 55 milliliters inhaled during a puff for 3 seconds every 30 seconds. Cannabis is consumed in a total different way. It's more sessions, it's only a couple of puffs. It's not necessarily like a cigarette where you have to have the 12 quote-unquote 12 puffs for one cigarette all at once because it's consuming. Cannabis vaping, you can literally have it in your pocket, and some of you have seen me, I've been vaping for 3 days. You can vape completely differently. And if you want more info, I think the decks are going to be available. There's a link here that shows our 2021 survey of vaping topography where we actually come up with a vaping regime specific to cannabis. So with that regime, that's the basis for all of the emissions testing, because emissions are different depending on the regime, of course. Now, looking into emissions, what's the link with rheology? There's a lot of different moduli on storage, loss, doing a temperature sweep. I'm going to show you some highlights after this. And most importantly, how do we measure all of this? It's with the ACM, the aerosol collected mass. Leaking, clogging of a cartridge are really a function of all of these parameters. And controlling those parameters allows to bring a better experience, better aerosol collected mass, or better deliverability for patients. Now, on the left side, you see a rheological report. This is a temperature sweep where we're basically testing the product in a cartridge from 20 to 70 degrees Celsius. On the left side, you have the consistent storage modulus. That is the blue line. That is the most important here. The red line is viscosity, very easy, same in both graphs. Obviously goes down more with more temperature. The green line is the loss modulus, where we do see a consistent loss of energy in Pascal. That's really what's expected. Now the focus is the blue one. That's the storage modulus. That's how much energy in Pascal does the concentrate and the cannabis inside your vaping device store. Basically, it has to be something fairly consistent for the deliverability to be here and for bioavailability to work with your patients. And that's what you don't see on the right side. It's basically the elasticity of the oil that's in your cartridge. Some of the variables and what they mean when we're looking at emissions testing. So we just spoke about aerosol collected mass. We also measure this, of course, with DWL, device weight loss, to correlate with ACM and understand exactly what was vaporized and how rheology affects the emissions. Pressure drop, that's basically the resistance to airflow. That's when you're simulating a puff. The delivered cannabinoids, and I'm going to show you a slide at the end where we can really pinpoint how the cannabinoids are delivered throughout the life cycle of a device or a cartridge. And it's scary sometimes because some of the cannabinoids actually disappear when you get towards the end of the cartridge. So if you're looking, for instance, for CBN, at the end of the cartridge, after using it for a couple of days, there's no more CBN in there. It all disappeared. So it's very, very important to understand how each of these cannabinoids is delivered as well. Something you'll see, and you can see this really everywhere in tobacco, is the aldehyde exposure. Now, why would we look at the aldehyde exposure? That's really the dry hits. Basically, when your coil and the medium, the wicking material that contains and aerosolizes the extract is burning. And that's how we can measure if there's a dry hit or if the wicking material has all the right properties to encapsulate and deliver that aerosol. So very easily, if you want to simulate, for instance, a dry hit on any cartridge, take a couple of puffs in a row, and you'll quickly see that the last puffs don't taste good. And when you measure that on a vaping machine, you're going to see that the delivered cannabinoids are completely different, off the charts, not to mention the potential degradants, which I'm not even covering here. And finally, heavy metal exposure. There's a lot of talk about heavy metals, and the immediate go-to is it's the device. Well, actually 80% of the heavy metal results for cannabis and vaping products comes from the oil. That said, what is responsible for heavy metals in emissions is very often due to the hardware and the concentrate that you're putting into these devices. To give you a very simple example, you look at distillate, roughly a pH of 4. The more terpenes you add, the more pH goes down, the more acid it is, and the more leaching can happen with the materials that are in your device. So this is basically the three potential results once you go through all of this test. Is a restrictive attribution, which really shows that there's potential aldehydes, flavor, poor performance. This is really, again, the genesis of starting all of this research, is to make sure that we're delivering product in the correct way to patients. When we're looking at something that's oversized, that means potentially the intake holes are too big. The wicking material is not absorbing enough of the concentrate. That leads to clogging, which then turns into leaking. And then there's the sweet spot. And that's where we hit the symbiotic relationship between the hardware and the concentrate, is a proper feed and matched rheology. Now, you want to adapt and do rheology testing with every single concentrate out there, it's practically impossible. But in certain cases, when you're looking at very specific applications, it is definitely needed. And unfortunately, not many people are willing to do this in this industry. I mean, we're an ancillary company. We manufacture hardware. Sometimes I get asked by my investors, why are we doing this research? Why aren't the processors doing it? Well, we're neutral. We can anonymize. We can take our clients' oils and test it without knowing which is which. I think a lot of the processors are afraid of the liability of potentially finding something that they're not going to like and ending up with a master settlement agreement in 20 years, like tobacco. Finally, a little nugget of information here. This is what I was alluding to in the beginning. We have 3 different types of hardware. You can see when they're filled at 100%, at 50%, at 10%. We track all cannabinoids. We also track terpenes. I just put the main 2 here, CBD and THC, and you can see that in certain cases, when the product is, for instance, 10% full, you see these numbers change drastically. Now, when you're providing these products to patients who don't know anything about the science, who don't know anything about cannabis, it's very, very important that they are made aware that at the end of the cartridge, you're not going to have the same experience than at the beginning of it. Basically, is decreased efficiency over time with this hardware. And this is something that no one's ever going to be looking into because it's essentially admitting that the hardware doesn't match the oil. But it happens today in 95% of the products that are on the market. That's it. Thank you very much.